Typically in Photoshop, I'm a stickler for organization. But in the case of this composite, I'm more interested in seeing the images inside of my layers panel. You can easily achieve a larger icon by going to the options, choosing panel options, and then choosing this ginormous icon right here. By default, you'll typically see something like this, and that might not be beneficial, especially when you're doing something so visual. So having said all that, I'm going to turn off all these layers by hitting the eyeball. And you'll notice that I have the clouds behind the mountains. And in the earlier lesson, I showed you guys how we're going to use a layer mask to see the clouds behind it. But what I want to do right now is a very rough comp based on some of the ideas we talked about. For example, when I show this particular one with the ice, I'm going to go ahead and see if it's going to look good. And once again, this is just going to be a quick way for us to gauge whether or not this is going to work as, that sheet of ice I mentioned for this particular effect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I'm on the proper layer. First of all, let me undo that a couple times. I want to be on this layer. Press Command or Control T, and I'll just move this down and scale it like so. And I'm just going to, squint my eyes a little bit and see whether or not this will pass off as the ice that I'm trying to achieve. I'm going to go ahead and hide that now. I'm going to grab this layer, turn that on, and do the same thing. When you're doing a composite, it's going to be a constant back and forth as you try to get ideas to see what's going to work for you. So I'm going to go ahead and just pull this layer and resize it a little bit. Just try to see if I can get this to look like it belongs there. Of course, it needs a lot of work, but sometimes you need to stretch some of these things out. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the space bar on my keyboard just to expand that and move it around a little bit. And I'm going to just push this down. And that might work actually. That might work if I paint out some of this stuff here. And if I try to, do something fancy. For example, I can take this layer and I can drag it to the new layer icon to duplicate it. And I can take that duplicate layer that's underneath it and I can move it up and I can do things like this, for example. I can press Command or Control T and I can grab one end and I can flip it so that they're not exactly matching and take this one here and do something like that. So all of a sudden we have an entirely new look. But of course, in reality, things would get less saturated as it goes further into the distance, as you see by this mountain back there. It's almost very difficult to tell what color it is because it's so far away. And that's just something that happens with the atmosphere. So we'd have to probably blur this one out or desaturate it in some fashion. But so far, I think I like the way that might look. So I'm going to turn this off as well. And let's just see what I have here as far as this rock here. So I'm going to turn this one back on real fast. And I'm going to just go to this layer and scale it down a little bit. And if I were to put this in here somehow, would that work? Let's see, that might help to break up the image. So I'm going to leave that as it is because we could just paint that away. And we can change the way this looks a little bit to make it look like it matches more. And, well, that might work somehow if we put that underneath one of these layers and drop the opacity down or something like that. Now, as I mentioned before, I want to bring this layer in, perhaps as a way to show us peeking through the trees and looking off in a distance. So we'll come back to that as well. I'll turn this layer on and I want to see if this is going to work as well. So I'm going to go back to these other ones. We'll turn that one off and we'll turn that one off. And what I want to do is I'm going to just squash that down a little bit and see whether or not the idea of this being ice works for me. And this is something that you'll find very common when you're doing comps. You're going to brainstorm out loud. You want to try things and see how it's going to look before you actually get down to work. So I'm going to take this one now. And that looks a little too clean. It might work somehow if we can blend it in. But what I'm thinking so far that I like is I like the way this works so far. I'm not sure about this sheet of ice. I'm going to move it to the top of this guy here. maybe we could paint out a portion of it and have it look like there might be a little bit of a lake going on here somehow. So that's something I'm thinking about as well. All right, so what I'm ready to do now is start to composite some of these guys here. And we'll talk about how we can possibly blend some of these unused ones into the comp, or we could simply delete them. So on your own as well, do what I'm doing and just play around and see what might or might not work for you. And I'll see you guys in the next part.